morning or evening or whatever it is to you. This is the first section, I think, of three that will be on the rise of industry or industrial America. This is another way that America expands greatly after the Civil War before 1900. And we go from being fifth or sixth industrial manufacturing power in the world to number one in the world, which we still are today. What happens with China, we will see 50 years from now, but as of today, for the last 125 years, America has been the world's industrial power, much bigger, much more productive than any other country on the face of the earth. So we will see what happens with that as time goes on. Before 1800, America was not even in the running. We were non-industrial. We were almost all agricultural, 95% small farmers or large farmers. The largest company in America in 1800 had maybe 20 employees. So these were very small operations. By 1900, we have not only the largest industrial production, but we have companies employing hundreds of thousands of people. This is the America we recognize today. It happened very quickly in America. It happened again in about 30 years. So while we are settling the West, we are also expanding economically. For 50 straight years after the Civil War, we had 4% growth, economic growth per year, which is phenomenal. Our manufacturing value went from $2 to $8 billion. I don't care about the numbers. I'm just giving you an idea. Today, if we get 1.5%, 2% growth a year, that's considered phenomenally good. They had 4% a year every year for over 50 years. So the first slide in that file, in that folder, is on what a country needs to become a great industrial power or a great economic power. And this is an interesting list because it is still true today. You can look at countries around the world and predict their economic future and also tell about their economic past by using the same factors. And we happen to have in America a combination of all of the economic factors that you needed for great industrial growth. First of all, you had natural resources. Number one, America is big. If you are a small country, that's a built-in problem. Where are you going to get the resources? Today, that has changed a little bit because we have resources in intellectual property in people's minds, and we have electronic stuff, we have computers. This was not true 100 years ago. Resources were literally physical resources that you got from the land. So places like Finland, a small country in which I lived, or Switzerland or Belgium, had limitations on their growth because they are very small countries, particularly limitations on energy sources. Where do you get the energy for heat, to run machines, to power anything? Finland today still has that problem. Their energy largely comes from coal, and the coal comes from Russia. That's why Finland always has to play nice with Russia. Russia will turn the heat off if they don't. But America was a huge country. We had energy resources. We had coal, lots of coal in several places. Later on, we had oil. Both of those things can create electricity, which comes around after 1900. We had timber for construction. We had timber for fuel. We had timber to build railroads with. We had enough water. Water is an absolute necessity. A good example of this are countries in the Sahara in Africa or the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. There is no water. So what do you have to do? It's really a limit on production. The Arab states, being very wealthy, having large resources of oil, they buy water. They bring in tanker ships full of water. The other thing they have done is build desalination plants and take seawater and turn it into fresh water. Very expensive. So you need a lot of money if you're going to do that. But we have ways of doing that now. 100 years ago, there was no way. You had to have water. Water also powers machinery. You had to have minerals, iron ore, We had lots and lots of iron ore around the Great Lakes. There are huge mountain ranges full of iron ore. Iron makes steel. Steel makes machinery. Steel makes skyscrapers possible. You cannot build a cast iron building more than 2 or 3 floors tall. When you get steel, you begin to get skyscrapers, and Chicago was the place that pioneered this. That's why when you go up to the top of those 100-story buildings, you can feel the building move a little bit. Steel, oddly enough, has tensile strength, they call it, but a little bit of flexibility. If that building was made of cast iron, it would crack and fall to pieces. Besides the weight, if you have a cast iron skillet in your kitchen, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. The other thing we needed was the money to help build factories, to expand the economy. We had that because of the gold and silver strikes, which we talked about last time. We had plenty of money to invest. The people who made money off of the gold and silver mines turned around, they're looking for someplace to invest it. They invested it in manufacturing. So all of these natural resources were a huge advantage to America, and they're all necessary. The second thing you need is cheap labor. America had roughly 77 million people. In 1900, we had lots and lots of available labor. We had and still have a relatively young population. You need young, healthy workers. Where were we getting them from? Of course, high birth rate. There was very little birth control at all. Average family had, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids, sometimes more. So that was a source of labor. And the other thing was huge immigration, which we will talk about in the next chapter. 8 million come before 1890, another 15 million from 1890 to 1914. So I will talk more about this later, but in 1900, or shortly before World War I, 1 out of 3 Americans was either an immigrant or the child of immigrants. Immigrants were a huge advantage, young, healthy workers. The workers and the immigration also created a bigger market to sell the products in, which is also a good thing. But you can look again in countries around the world, and this has become a serious problem in a number of countries where the population is aging rapidly, they are not having very many children, and they closely restrict their immigration. Japan is the shining example of this. So very strict immigration, they don't allow much of it. The birth rate is very, very low, and Japan is today the oldest average country in the world. They have an increasingly geriatric population. Right now, it is not a crisis. In the next 30 years, it will be a crisis. They will not have enough workers to support a very large elderly population, and they live forever in Japan. America is fortunate. And there are pros and cons about immigration, but one of the pros on immigration is immigrants are usually young. They are young, healthy workers most of the time. And you have to have more young than old in a population. This is a problem everywhere in the world. The other one in Europe, which is, you'd never guess this one, Italy is the most geriatric country in Europe. Many, many young Italians have left and are still leaving because of the economy, and their birth rate is well under 2 per family. So you go to Italy, and there's a whole lot of old people and very few younger people. This is a really serious long-term problem, and they don't know what to do about it. They're working on it. Some countries like Germany have built-in government incentives. In Germany, I knew friends when we lived there who had children, and the German government pays Kindergeld, child money, literally. You have a child, the government will send you money every month up to, I think, about the age of 5, till the kid hits 5. Why? They are encouraging people to have children. They know that the population dynamics cannot get too skewed toward an older population. Anyway, not a problem for America at all. In the early 1900s, we had more labor. You get off the boat, you got a job. New technologies, new inventions. There is a list in that chapter of America has always been very inventive. This was an age of huge technological advances. We are trained in America and have been historically to think outside the box. We come across a problem, we invent a way to deal with it. We talked about this when the farmers went out on the plains and they didn't have any trees. Within 15 years, they had invented ways to deal with all of it. New technologies that were particularly important in this period: refrigeration, including refrigerated ships, and by 1900, refrigerated trains, so you could ship things around the country. I'm going to talk about the railroad later, huge expansion of the railroad, the telephone, the typewriter, which replaced hand copying things, the sewing machine. Think about how long it would take you to sew a foot of something by hand and how long it takes anybody to sew something on a machine. Before the Civil War, all clothing, all fabric was sewn by hand. After the Civil War, before 1900, everything is sewn on a machine. You go to a store and you can buy something. New business organizations I'll talk about in a minute, but all of these things are new inventions, new technologies. Petroleum comes in a little bit after 1900 as well, as a new energy source and as a new lighting source. Transportation and communication: you can have all the resources in the world and all the labor in the world, and if you cannot move things around, your economy is paralyzed. The example I always use this is Somalia today, which has huge oil resources, which could be a very wealthy country with a decent government, but they have, not making this up, 50 miles of paved road and no railroads. So until somebody goes in and builds the infrastructure, and it may be China, Somalia can't do anything with its resources. We, by 1900, built a whole infrastructure of transportation. Things moved around much faster. By 1900, America was selling oranges to Spain, cheaper than the Spanish could raise them, and beer to Germans in Germany, because we could manufacture and transport it cheaper than they could make it there at home. So transportation is a huge advantage. Another thing, and conservatives are absolutely right about this, that government regulation stifles economic development. Too much government regulation absolutely will. There were no income taxes until the First World War, and then dropped after that. There was almost no government regulation on anything. You wanted to start a business, you went out and started it. There was no regulation. This can be a good and bad thing, as we'll see later. But it certainly led to people trying out a whole lot of things. The money to invest, I think that's the end of the list. America in 1900 is producing half of the world's cotton, half of the world's corn, half of the world's oil, half of the world's copper, a third of the world's steel, a third of the world's iron, silver, and gold. Example: Chicago, which was a great meatpacking city, which processed and packed meat products, in 1870 had already figured out how to slaughter and package pork. From the time the pig entered the factory until the time it left the factory in a canned meat, was 12 minutes. This was a great American innovation that spread around the world. Refrigeration comes along in stationary buildings about 1875, but by 1900 in railway cars and in ships. Okay, Minnesota, another good example of transportation. Minnesota was producing 35 million bushels of wheat a year and shipping out per day for 2 months in the fall, 328 railway cars full of wheat. Transportation is vital. Okay, part of the new innovations were new ways of doing businesses, new ways of organizing businesses. There were new ways to sell products. If you can move products around, remember before the Civil War, if you needed a pair of boots, you went into town and the local bootmaker made you a pair of boots just for your feet. After the Civil War, you go to a store and you buy what you need because things can be shipped around. Chain stores, department stores, Sears Roebuck, for example, Montgomery Ward is another one who just went under last year. Department stores that held a whole lot of different products were a huge advantage. Mail order catalogs that came every year in the mail, and everybody in America waited for their Sears catalog or their Monkey Ward catalog. Everything. They sold everything from shoes to boots to farm equipment to dresses to underwear to, and I'm not making this up, entire houses. You could order a house and they would ship it out to you on the railway, including the nuts and the bolts and the screws and the nails, and you could construct the house. Most of them are still standing. They were very high quality houses as well. So everything from underwear to entire houses you could order from a mail order catalog. The other thing that comes along, because there are multiple sources for products now, not just the local dealer, is advertising, which of course is getting worse and worse for us. Advertising is a new innovation. Why should I buy this company's shoes rather than the other one? They advertise. They have better advertising. New business organizations that came along, a corporation that was pioneered by Rockefeller and Carnegie. Corporations are basically what the stock market does. You buy a share of a company, anybody can buy it. Shares, pieces were offered to the public, and in a corporation, it was directed and run by the shareholders. So instead of one guy running a company, you had the people the investors essentially running the company. If they made a profit one year, great. If you lost money, that was too bad. But whatever the profit or loss was of the company, you got your percentage of it. A trust or a holding company is an elaboration of this. When these companies got huge, the stockholders, or there were too many stockholders, they gave their control to a managing board of directors. And that became a trust or a holding company. So, for example, Standard Oil became a trust. And it wasn't run by just Rockefeller. It wasn't run by a small group of people. It was run by a board of managers who oftentimes did not have any direct interest in the company. They were professional businessmen. You could also have many smaller companies that were managed by a board someplace else. In other words, the business managers. Pros and cons to this, of course. A cartel or a pool is something that we have around today in many forms. Cartel or pool was a group of producers in a certain industry, and they set the prices, they set the production levels of a product. The standard example is OPEC, oil producing and exporting countries. The price of oil is largely determined by Mideast companies that produce oil. The first cartel or pool was really an American invention, and it was the railroads that were owned by a small group of people. Another word for this today would be an oligopoly, where you have a small number of producers or people that control an entire industry. You can think of these all over. Look at the internet companies. You have choices. They're all fairly expensive, and there are a limited amount of choices. They control that industry. Airlines is another one. You do have a choice of airlines. If you poke around, there is some difference in prices, but you can't walk from here to Saskatchewan, Canada. You can't even take a train there. You have to fly. So a group of large airlines largely control most of the airline business and set their prices. The other new introduction you have is what we call finance capitalism, where you have big banks and big bankers who invest directly in companies, which today there are all kinds of restrictions because we saw what happened a little over 10 years ago when banks almost went under because they had invested in businesses that were going bankrupt. The result is nationally concentration, that many companies become very, very large, and they buy out the smaller companies. By 1900, some examples: 1% of corporations, of companies, controlled 1/3 of all the production in America and 40% of the profits. Specific example, American tobacco. Look on the back of cigarette packages or chewing tobacco. Almost all of them say American tobacco. There used to be, at the time of the Civil War, 200 small companies. American tobacco swallowed up 162 small tobacco companies and controlled 95% of the market. Many people become incredibly wealthy. I'm going to talk about that in another video. In 1860, we actually had 10 what we would call millionaires today. By 1890, we had over 4,000. And the question was, what do you do with incredibly wealthy people? Because we had not had this issue before. And not only millionaires, but multi-billionaires, what we would call billionaires today. Okay, the second thing, and I'm starting with slide number 4 here on the PowerPoint, were the railroads. And they are one of the vital necessities for economic expansion and a wonderful example of what happens moving from competition between small companies to consolidation into several large ones. Railroads were the first very large companies in America that employed thousands of people over thousands of miles transcontinentally. They were the ones who created the first professional managers, because they're very large companies, the first supervisors, and the first supervisors over supervisors in America. First billionaires were railroad billionaires and millionaires in America. And of course, the huge advantage of railroads is they are the first time you can actually go faster than the speed of a horse, 2 or 3 miles an hour. And they ran about 50 miles an hour well before 1900. They still are in America today. We have very few bullet trains going 200 miles an hour. In the beginning, most railroads were built by private companies east of the Mississippi. But you get west of the Mississippi, you have huge distances with very sparse population, and it was very clear that the government was going to have to step in and help subsidize the building of railroads because no private company could make enough money to ever build one there. So government has some resources, but we've just finished the Civil War. The country does not have a lot of economic resources. What we do have is an awful lot of land. So they did parcel out some low-rate loans at pretty reasonable interest rates. They did give some tax incentives. They paid by the mile, which is why there was a race between East and West to lay the most tracks, because you got paid by the mile by the government. And the government also promised, you build a railway, we will send all of the U.S. mail and all of the military supplies and troops on your railway. So this is really the kickstart to national railways, to transcontinental railways. If you look at those next 2 maps, slide 5 and 6, you can see before the Civil War, everything stops at the Mississippi. After the Civil War, we have not 1 but 5 transcontinental railways by 1900. We have 5 times the amount of tracks. 1865, we had 35,000 miles of track, almost all of it east of the Mississippi. By 1900, we have 260,000 miles of tracks. The record, 1887, they laid 13,000 miles of track in 1 year. By 1900, the United States had more railway mileage than Europe and Russia combined together. What they did to kickstart it, besides some loans, were huge land grants. And if you look at the slide number 8, you can see the state of Montana. Montana's an awful big state, and the fuzzed area is the land that was granted to the Great Northern Railway. This is a large portion of the state of Montana, millions of acres. Huge land grants, 180 million acres given to railways on the promise that they would build lines. In Texas alone, 32 million acres were given to rail lines to build railways, particularly in West Texas. The land was given in alternate sections. They didn't just give you a huge chunk, they gave you smaller pieces. They divided the huge chunks into small pieces like a checkerboard, so that the railway couldn't sell the whole thing to, let's say, a wealthy rancher. They had to sell it to small farmers. That was good for the railway because it created more customers for their rail line. It was also good for the US government because it let settlers move out there very inexpensively. The effects of the railways, immediately it opened the West. And we began building them immediately after the Civil War. People and towns spread along the railway. In essence, they subsidized their future customers. This is why when you go to weird places like rural Wyoming or Western Canada, and you go to some of these old railway towns that are now highway towns, you see things like Greek restaurants or Chinese restaurants. What are you doing in the middle of rural Wyoming? I've actually asked people in Greek restaurants, the Greek owners of them, oh yeah, Grandpa came to work on the railway, and they stayed, and they ended up opening a Greek restaurant. You can still trace the line of the railways. So it opens the West. The other thing it does is create a national market with regional specializations. For the first time, you can grow what is, or raise or produce what is good in your area, because now you can ship it cheaply and quickly around the country. This is what I would call the Walmart effect. Walmart moves into a town, everything else closes. They drive everybody else out of business. A modified version of that was going on in the late 1900s because people could specialize. For example, Florida could grow oranges very inexpensively and well and ship them around the country. California shipped produce. Wisconsin, cheeseheads. Idaho, potatoes. Texas, beef. We already talked about with the cattle industry. So regions could specialize because now it was a national market. It also kick-started, of course, capitalism, because small people who started with small railways gradually bought out each other and expanded and became huge corporations. And the slide number 9 is the king of the railway kings, which was a man named Jay Gould, who became so wealthy, not always by honest means, that he actually tried to corner the gold market in the 1870s. In other words, buy up as much gold as he could and raise the prices. He almost crashed the US economy. He was incredibly powerful. He said, and I'm quoting, "I don't build railways, I buy them." And he would buy out small railways, and of course, the minute he did, what would happen? He would jack up the prices. You don't have much choice. You can't go 300 miles to the next railway. So not exactly the nicest guy, but our first really railroad tycoon, very, very famous. A lot of corruption in the railway industry. Who built the railways? You can see in the text, the railways were built by immigrant labor. In the West, the Chinese. In the East, not Chinese. And the first thing most students want to say is, oh, slaves. No slave labor. Slaves stayed in the South at this point. Immigrant labor, largely the Irish. And the Irish and the Chinese, East and West Coast, lived, worked, and died like dogs. And we are just now beginning to find out more about the conditions of these railway camps. They literally lived in things that we would call dog kennels today. Caves in the sides of banks. High death rates, of course, oftentimes worked to death. So the railways were not a pretty business, but incredibly innovative. They had to go through mountains, they had to cross roaring rivers, they had to confront all kinds of geographic obstacles, and within a few years, we had a transcontinental railway. Within 30 years, we had 5 of them, plus hundreds of thousands of other lines, trunk lines that led into the main lines. We had transportation, the American economy could boom. Okay, thanks very much. Stay safe out there.